Some of this material might be too familiar to some of you, but it's also worth rehearing again. So what I'm going to try to do is situate for you this genocide that has been happening for over a year and a half now, and situate it within a larger context of Israeli settler colonial genocide of the Palestinian people, so that you can have a better way to frame what is happening in this moment as part of this much larger historical structure that has been going on for over 100 years. Because you don't want to exceptionalize this moment as if what has been happening the last year and a half is brand new, or as if it doesn't have any historical precedent. It does, and it was all too predictable that we would see what we are seeing today. So the story of Palestine, obviously I'm not going to be able to go into all the details of the different segments of this story, but happy to engage more in the Q&A discussion. But the story of Palestinians, we'll start it with the Ottomans. Under the Ottomans, is that they, of course, lived under the Ottoman Empire, like other Arab nations did at the time. That experience for Palestinians was not ideal, but it was also an experience in which they never really gave up their sovereign claims to their lands. And to some extent, they lived sovereign lives on their lands, even under Ottoman rule. The Ottoman Empire was very much known by scholars to be a largely decentralized form of empire. The Ottomans would vacillate between being too centralized and sometimes too decentralized, but for the most part, Palestinians lived under a decentralized Ottoman Empire, which means that they, of course, submitted to the ultimate authority of the Ottomans in the sense of they still had to pay taxes to the Ottomans, they still had to send their young people into the Ottoman army and so on and so forth. But they still managed to have some degree of autonomy from the Ottoman Empire during those years. And when the Ottomans went too far in being centralized towards the Palestinians, as happened in other parts of the Arab world, there was rebellion against that. And they would use all sorts of techniques and strategies to try to get the Ottomans off their backs. So, for instance, they might not register a newborn baby in the Ottoman papers, so that person would not be drafted by the Ottomans to go fight for their wars. They might not register their lands in their own names, because that way they can't be taxed for them. Things like this they did under Ottoman rule. But Palestinian society was largely rural. Fallahin, translates roughly into peasants, which means that something like 90% of the population lived on the land, off the land, and sold whatever extra they produced in order to get other things that they needed for life. There was, of course, also urban centers. There was educational institutions and so on and so forth, but there was a strong sense of a Palestinian identity that belonged to the larger, identities are layered, right? Like even today, they're still layered. But certainly during the time, Palestinian identities would be layered. So they would have their, kinship, local identity, and then that would, the layer after that is the kind of more, immediate regional identity, and then above that you go to Palestine, and above that is part of the Blad al-Sham, the greater Syria, and then above that is the Arab identity, and so on and so forth, right? But they had a strong feeling of sovereign existence, and they had had that for thousands of years on those lands. During around this time period that I'm describing, which is late 1800s, you had the emergence of modern political Zionism in Europe, specifically in Central and Eastern Europe. It's starting to really take hold. And this political ideology starts to assert that European Jews will never be welcome in Europe. That Europe is inherently anti-Semitic, which it is, and was never going to accept European Jews as equal citizens, and that they were always therefore going to experience great forms of discrimination and violence, right? Prior to the Holocaust, there was, of course, the pogroms and many other violences that European Jews had faced, in especially Eastern Europe, but also in other parts of Europe, including Western Europe. And this ideology asserted that since European Jews will never be accepted in Europe as equals, then they have to leave Europe. And they have to establish a state that would become part of Europe, but not inside of Europe, but rather in the lands of the Orient, quote unquote, right? So they sought the solution to the Jewish question in Europe, which is the question of anti-Semitism. They sought to answer it by saying, we're going to leave Europe and we're going to build a European-like state in the lands of the Orient that will make us as finally equals to Europeans, and we can stand side by side with them, but we're always going to be part of them too, because we are European. And they considered different parts of the world for the creation of this Jewish state. Argentina, parts of Africa were considered, and Palestine. And eventually the Zionist movement would settle on Palestine because of their spiritual connections to that land. They thought, well, this could help us convince European Jews to move there, because that was one of the biggest hurdles for the Zionist movement. Despite the mythology and the propaganda that you hear today, European Jews were not jumping on this chance to go leave Europe and go somewhere else, because why would they? Europe is their home. They're just as French as any Frenchman, and just as German as any German person, just as Russian as any Russian person, and that was reality. It was racist to say anything but that, really. So it was not an easy sell, but so they focused on Palestine, and they knew that they needed the help of a European imperial power to help them create that Jewish state. They knew that they couldn't do it on their own, that their project was inherently hostile to the natives that they were going to expel in order to create that Jewish state, and that therefore they needed a great power to help them achieve that. You need a lot of power to do something like this, a settler colonial project. It's not easy. They actually tried to convince the Ottomans at first, and the Ottomans listened to them, but they were like, no. Eventually, with World War I, the opportunity opened up with the British coming in and the creation of the British Mandate in Palestine. Now, the British wanted, of course, still presumably, or arguably, still at that point, the greatest empire, although some people will say the US was already passing it in the 20th century. But anyway, those debates aside, it's still a very, very powerful empire. And they wanted to defeat the Ottomans. The Ottomans were viewed as, a rival empire. The British wanted their stuff. And that included the Middle East. One of the strategies that the British used in defeating the Ottoman Empire is to bring some of the Arabs onto their side to fight with them in the war against the Ottomans in World War I. And the promise for the Arabs was, we're going to give you all your independent states afterwards. We're going to help you overthrow the Ottomans, you'll get rid of that empire, and we're not an empire that's going to come and be here forever. We're just going to create mandates, help you get on your feet, and give you your freedom, because we're such nice people. Of course, the British were not interested in any of that. They were interested, as an imperial power is the basic things that all empires are interested in. Trade routes, resources, markets. Those are the three things that empires go after. That's it. All of this talk about we're spreading civilization is all BS. It's just about generation of power and wealth, period. And that's what the British were interested in. And they promised the Arabs, okay, fight with us, we'll give you your independence, including in Palestine. So they told the Arabs, you'll get an independent, sovereign Palestinian state in Palestine, just like you would in Jordan, Iraq, etc. Right? But the British, promised Zionists, European Jews, that they would give them a Jewish state on that same piece of land. The British, being the expert liars that they were at the time, were quite. There's a lot of evidence for it. I mean, you can laugh, but like they were really good at lying. Just aside, I'll transgress, but like the letter that one of these British colonial officers wrote to one of the Arab leaders in what is today Saudi Arabia, the whole first page is like praise for the guy. Because they knew that was going to be like, oh yeah, just build up his ego and tell him how great he is, and he liked this. They knew what they were doing. They're not idiots. But of course they didn't believe any of that nonsense, but they were playing him. And it worked. Still does. Anyway, I digress, like I said. So the British promised the land for both. But the British from the very beginning knew that what they really wanted was a Jewish state. For two main reasons. One, the British Empire did not want European Jewish refugees from Eastern and Central Europe coming into the UK. They didn't want them there. Canada didn't want them here. The US didn't want them there either. All of this, right? Like this is all very well established, documented history. They didn't want them there. Because they are anti-Semitic, and they're like, we don't want poor Jews coming here, especially not Russian-speaking ones. So how do we deal with the Jewish problem? Just send them elsewhere. That's it. So that was a very important reason why the British Empire supported this idea. The second and more important reason, I would say, is that they knew that establishing a Jewish state in the heart of the Middle East would create a powerful state, potentially at the time, of course you couldn't know for sure, but they knew with their support, and then the fact that these are really Europeans, that they could create a very powerful state that would help secure British interests. And it would be a state that would forever be loyal to the British Empire. Why? Because its survival would depend on the British. If you have an ally whose survival depends on you, you got them. They're not going to go against you. You couldn't do that with even the Arab regimes that they were propping up. They were like, they could turn on us. It's possible. They could be overthrown through eternal struggle. We could lose that, right? Like, it's not as reliable. But a Jewish state whose survival depends on us will forever be for our side. Will never really hurt our interests in the region. That's a critical point to keep in mind, because this is where the American Empire comes in later. The British, though, couldn't outright meet Jewish Zionist demands. The Zionists wanted all of the land of Palestine. And they wanted all the Arabs and Palestinians to be removed from that land, and the creation, and then for those people to be absorbed into other Arab nations, because they're racist. They're like, oh, well, they're just all Arabs. They can live in any other Arab land, right? Which is a ridiculous idea. But it only makes sense in a racist worldview. So it's like the US coming in and telling you, well, you're all Canadian, go live in Ontario, Alberta's mine, everybody's got to leave, right? Like, you would think that's stupid and idiotic and racist and violent and all that. It's the exact same situation in Palestine, right? But anyway, so that's what they wanted. The British couldn't quite just say yes to that, because they still had a lot of interests aligned with the Arab leaders and regimes that were emerging. They couldn't just tell them, oh, we're not gonna do this whole Palestine thing after all, at all. They couldn't do that. So they were limited in their ability to create a Jewish state across all of Palestine and expelling all or the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian Arabs. The Arab regimes that supported them and that they had alliances with would not go along with that. So they were not able to do that. So the British kind of went back and forth, but in terms of what their plans for Palestine would be when the mandate ends. But for sure, what they wanted was the establishment of a strong Jewish state, people to buy European Jews, and the expulsion of Palestinians from those lands. How big that percentage is and all of that, there were debates within the British Empire over all of that. But ultimately, they knew when their mandate was ending in 1948, as the British Empire was weakened and could no longer hold on to its imperial outposts across the world, is that they armed the Zionist militias more and better, and trained them better, and they wanted them to win. As a result, when the British mandate ended, the Zionist forces were able to overwhelm the Palestinian community and led into what we call the Nakba, 1948 Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe, where approximately 55% of the total Palestinian population were expelled from their lands, and Israel was created as a Jewish state for a Jewish majority on 78% of the land of Palestine. So after 48, 78% of the land of Palestine becomes Israel, and the Palestinian population in that land is now expelled, killed, and they become refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, and in other Arab countries, predominantly Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. And others, like you had some more in Syria, moving to the Gulf, but those were the biggest populations, refugee populations of Palestinians. Today's in Lebanon and Jordan. So that's the whole root of the issue. That's the whole root of the issue, is the expulsion of Palestinians from their lands and the establishment of exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty on those lands. And the claim that only Jews have the right to live on this land and be the absolute, indivisible sovereign authority. No such thing as Palestinian sovereignty. They will only tolerate a minority of Palestinians to remain on that land, to be ruled under Israeli sovereignty. So those Palestinian communities would not have sovereignty. So this project was about the elimination of Palestinian sovereign existence on the land, which has existed for thousands of years. In the tangible sense of the word sovereignty, not necessarily the international law. We can talk about that. I mean, international law does not decide when a people are sovereign. The indigenous people of these lands are still the sovereign people of the land, even though they're not recognized as such by international law or by Canadian law. They're still the sovereign people of these lands. They had sovereign existence on these lands for centuries before they were robbed of it through a settler colonial project. Same situation in Palestine. So that's the whole root cause. This is not a religious conflict or a cultural conflict or any of this nonsense. This is about the expulsion of people from their land and their refusal to be expelled. Because what people in history do you know who are like, oh, okay, you know what, I'll leave. I'll leave my land that I've lived on for thousands of years, the lands of my forebears, and just submit to your authority if you let me stay, for those who get to stay. And then the rest are just going to leave and go, oh, okay, I'll just go live somewhere else. It is ridiculous to expect that from any human beings, any group of people. And the Palestinian people have refused that fate and have resisted their expulsion from their lands ever since. And it started, by the way, in the 1920s. I can go into that in the Q&A if people are interested. But because their expulsion from their land started in the 1910s, really. At any rate, so after 48, you have the establishment of Israel, and Israel the Zionist project was not satisfied with that. They wanted 100%, like I said. And it depends on who you read from the Zionist movement. They wanted more than 100%. So not just the 100% of Palestine, but parts of Lebanon and Syria. And if you read some of the other ones today, it includes parts of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt. Their idea of Greater Israel is that large. But they for sure wanted 100% of Palestine, and they wanted to ensure that Palestinian sovereign claims are erased once and for all. To this day, there's not been one leader of the Israeli state or any Zionist leader who has said, I accept the idea of Palestinian sovereignty. Those words have never been uttered by anyone who has led the Israeli government, left or right. Never. Never been offered. So when people talk about the two-state solution, which we can get to later, it's nonsense. Israel does not want it. They've never said that they want it. But due to the resistance of the Palestinians and other Arabs, they were not able to take 100% of Palestine in 1948. But that didn't mean that it was just going to end there for them. Their goal, again, was to take it 100%. They were never satisfied with 78%. Then in 1967, you have Israel taking the rest of it. So this is when they colonize 100% of Palestine in 1967 war, and begin the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, which has not ended since 1967. So in that period, they were still able to expel hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, but not to the extent that they were able to do in 1948. But the Israeli state was not satisfied with just becoming the occupying power forever. They took this as they're in it for the long haul now, to make life impossible for Palestinians, deny them their rights, and eventually expel the Palestinians from that remaining 22% of the land, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, to expel the Palestinians, the rest from that land, and take it all, and claim exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty over the entirety of the land, from the river to the sea. That is still the goal of the Israeli state today. Essentially, they did that through a bunch of different mechanisms. Settler colonial structures of genocide don't always involve mass killing or mass expulsion. They have different techniques. Some of them include changes in, what you name areas, how you map out, how you draw urban boundaries, settlement expansion. It's slow, but it's happening. Demolition of homes, squeezing Palestinian communities so much that they have the people in those communities go, I have no future here, I have to leave. Right? So what they call voluntary migration, which is not voluntary at all. So there's different techniques that they've used, which the term apartheid can capture since 1967. It was inevitable that you would see moments of mass expulsion and mass colonization, like we have seen over the last efforts to do that over the last year and a half. It was inevitable that was going to come because that was always the direction of the Israeli state, was to continue the mass expulsion of Palestinians. Now, where do the Americans come in? How do they enable this, and why? Before I jump fully into this genocide. So, after the British Empire falls apart, the US Empire starts to pick up the pieces and take over the British Empire and other Western European empires that were falling apart, take over their pieces and incorporate them into their own imperial dominance and generate US imperial power through that. In that process, of course, the Israeli settler colonial project becomes part of this US imperial orbit. It was not an immediate love at first sight between the two. The US empire is pragmatic, believe it or not, and always puts its interests first. This whole America first, we need to, that's always been the US. They've always been America first. They might have debates within themselves about, like, you're not really living up to that, sure, but but that's always been their goal of US imperialism, is to generate power and wealth for the American empire. That's it, nobody else. They don't care about any other people. Where they started to view the value of Israel was during the Cold War, where in the 60s, the Israelis proved to the Americans that they can be a huge asset in fighting against the Soviet Union in the region and beyond, not just in Palestine, not just in the Middle East, but even in South and Central America. This point is not really well known here, maybe, or in the US or in Western Europe, or maybe even in the Middle East. In South America, scholars don't even need to cite this point. It's so brazenly known and well documented that when the US was trying to do regime change in Central and South America to put in, overthrow democratically elected socialist governments and replace them with fascist right-wing governments that would install a neoliberal form of economics which would benefit American companies and American imperialism, it was the Israelis that would go in and arm those regimes or those coups and train those forces. If you read, like I said, South American scholars writing about this, it's just like a basic fact that no longer needs to be cited because it's so well known. So Israel was starting to prove itself for the Americans as a very valuable asset in fighting against the Soviet Union at the time during the Cold War, and against any force that was going to challenge US imperial power. Slowly they start to see Israel as, again, if we continue to arm them, if we make their existence possible, their survival possible as a settler colonial state, then they will forever be loyal to us. Similar to the appeal of the British Empire saw in Israel at the time, in the early parts of the 20th century, the Americans see in the latter half of the 20th century. If these people, if this state is dependent on its survival on us, they'll always be loyal to us. One quick example of how that looks. In 1986 or 87, when Biden was a senator, he gave that speech in Congress where he said if Israel didn't exist, the US would have to invent it, right? And listen, that speech is available on YouTube. Listen to the whole speech. The speech was done when he was standing in there to oppose the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia at the time, in the 80s. It was in that context that he raised that point. So why would he raise that point in the context of opposing the sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia? Listen to his own words. And I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially he said, you can't trust the Arabs. these regimes in Saudi Arabia, sure, they're on our side, but they must feel something for their brethren when they see their suffering. He's referring to Palestine. You can't depend on that. Israel, they're the ones doing the suffering. He didn't say that part, of course. And of course, he does the whole Israel's the only democracy, blah, 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 all that nonsense, but Biden is not that at all. Biden is a perfect example of American pragmatism, by the way. He's like, we can count on the Israelis. There's no danger of them ever turning on us. The Arab regimes, even though the Saudis, are in their pockets at the time, to this day, he's like not reliable enough. You can kind of see what that value they saw in an Israeli imperial outpost for them in the region. And of course, the American interests in the region are the same as the British, same as any other empire. Again, resources, trade routes, markets. Today, of course, it's not so much the resource of oil itself that they need from the region. They can produce more oil than or more energy resources, the U.S., than they need. But energy markets remain crucial for the American economic supremacy around the world. And guess what? The Middle East, the Arab countries, have a large part of that global energy market. Therefore, the policies that they have around energy production will have an effect on American economic supremacy. So they still have a huge interest in having a sort of established power and control over what is happening in the Middle East, precisely because of that importance of the energy markets in particular. But there are other things too, but that's a critical one. Right? So they see Israel as a critical imperial outpost for that purpose, is to help them continue to secure their imperial interests in the region. That spend then beyond the region, because that has a lot of significance for American power in general across the globe. And it's within this context that you start to have to see why the Americans are doing what they're doing over the last year and a half. Because whether it was Biden or Trump, Democrat or Republican, they've been actively supporting this genocide. And completely, preventing anything from stopping it. And you have to ask the question, why? A lot of people have asked that. It's like, why would they know that it's hurting their reputation, at the very least, that it's hurting their reputation, the American empires, if it did have any reputation, but, that it's hurting it. Why would they sacrifice so much of that in service of supporting this genocide? And moreover, when you really think about it, continued Israeli settler colonialism is not really in the American interests. The Americans don't need an imperial outpost that has 100% of Palestine. They're just fine with one that has control over the 78% of Palestine. They would be okay with a Palestinian state even emerging in the 22% left, so long as that Palestinian state is subservient to Israeli sovereignty, which it would be under all the two-state solution models proposed by Israel and the US. They would be okay with that. So it probably does annoy them when Israel continuously talks about we need to expel more Palestinians and create greater Israel. But despite all that, they still go ahead and support it unconditionally. And why? You must conclude from this, unless they completely lost their minds, which I don't think they have, the Americans, that they look at this and go, the benefit still outweighs the cost. Israel is that much of a benefit for US imperialism that they're willing to take all these hits for that. And the one point that the Biden administration, which at least rhetorically pushed, I'll use the word pushed back, very, very relatively speaking, on Israeli rhetoric. But despite all of the little pushbacks they did on everything, one thing they never pushed back on is the need to create a new security reality in the Middle East. They never said anything about that. And in fact, every time that the Israelis would say that, the Americans would say, yes, that is needed. So this tells you exactly what it is that the Biden administration and now the Trump administration see as a critical aspect of this genocide that they value more than anything else, which is that new security reality. And what it essentially means is complete American control over that region and the energy markets, and preventing any encroachment from especially China onto the region because of that. Ultimately, what the Americans are thinking about is not Palestinians. They couldn't give a damn about Palestinians. They are doing all of this to defeat China. As they see that. That's the only rival they really have. Or not even right now, but like a potential real rival. And they want to prevent that from emerging in the first place. So this is why they go full in on this genocide and take, like I said, some of the hits that they have taken, because they do think that the benefits of it is far outweighing the costs. What we end up with, of course, is one of the most brutal genocides that we have witnessed in our lifetime. That has been live streamed from us. The only reason I don't go into all the details here is I assume most people here are familiar with them and you're not blinded by the mass media propaganda that you see in a place like Canada, the US, and other Western places. But of course, the suffering is unbearable to even try to look at directly in the face. For Israeli state and society, Palestinians are not really human. That level of dehumanization has been happening for decades. It's not new. In 2021, I wrote about that in a column for Al Jazeera, that the levels of dehumanization are even higher today than they were prior to 1948. That the Israeli state does have the capacity to continue with the what Palestinians call the ongoing Nakba, with another great event of mass slaughter like we are seeing now. Of course, I wasn't going to try to predict exactly how it would happen, when it would happen, but when I wrote that in 2021, all I did say was, it's inevitable. If we remain on this path, it's inevitable that we're going to get, when the right circumstances present themselves for the Israelis, that they would undertake another Nakba. And unfortunately, that has come. The armed operation on October 7th was basically the pretext that the Israelis needed to justify what is an unjustifiable genocide. Nobody can justify genocide, of course, except unless you conceal it, and that's what they do. This is where we're at. This is how you try to comprehend and make sense of the current situation. The Palestinian people right now are going through, I would say, the most difficult moment in our history. Even more difficult than 1948. It was probably hard for many of us to conceive that something would be harder than 1948, but I think we're there right now. People are barely holding on, but they are holding on, and they are refusing to let go of their right to live a free sovereign life on all the lands of historic Palestine, not just in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem, but all of the lands. And the Palestinian people hold on to the right of return to all their lands. And Palestinians are a stateless people. We have no diplomatic capital, we have no economic capital, and we certainly have no military power. And it's a people power movement. That's what it is in Palestine. And that's what it is around the globe. And the one thing that you can continue to sort of hang your hat on in these moments of despair and unbelievable suffering is that people power across the world has answered, has said that no, they don't buy into the propaganda of the Israeli state and the US empire. That they see lies for what they are. And has rose up in support of the Palestinian people and their cause. People power is also limited, as we're seeing. Despite the worldwide protests and energies and actions that people have undertaken in every corner of the world, the genocide continues. Institutions and powerful institutions have responded with all of their power to try to defeat people power. With of course some exceptions of states that are trying to do something. They're not doing nearly enough of what they can be doing, but countries like South Africa, Colombia, and others, have stepped up and have tried to make some moves on the diplomatic front and the legal front in the international arena to stop the genocide. It was always going to be very limited. Like I said, they can do more. I've said this for a while, and I'll say it again. If tomorrow China, South Africa, Brazil, Colombia, Turkey, God forbid, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Morocco, and Indonesia all came out and said, we are all today announcing the severing of all economic and political ties with the Israeli state, and we're going to launch a campaign to isolate the Israeli state on the international scene economically, and we're going to be serious about this campaign, the genocide will stop in a few days. They literally have the power to stop it in a few days. So this nonsense that they can't do anything, it's the US, who can stand up to the US, don't buy it. This would stop it in a few days. But they don't want to. And they don't want to for a few reasons. One of which is that they all don't. Some of them don't want to give up their trade relations with Israel. Some of them don't want to upset the Americans too much. Some of them have too much competing ideologies among each other. Some of them are have joined the imperial project altogether, like Egypt. And of course, I'm talking about the Egyptian regime, not necessarily the people. Morocco, for sure, the regime is definitely separate from the people on these questions. There are things that can be done, but they're not being done by the powers that be because they still don't view it in their self-interest to do that. And it's up to us as people power to continue to push. Giving up in the face of this much violence might seem to some as the only rational thing to do, like, well, what else can we do? But it's not. Giving up to this means, submitting to US imperialism as well. Not just Israeli settler colonialism, not just, basically saying that the Palestinian people have to now submit to their fate of extinction. You're also at the same time saying, I give up. We're going to live under American imperialism and we're going to be subjugated to it. And I don't think many people around the world are too happy with that right now, including in Canada. The Palestinian struggle for liberation is not just about the Palestinian people and their own story. But it really is a story of the unfinished project of decolonization that started in the 20th century against Western imperialism, now being led by the US empire. And if people want to be free of that, then they should support Palestine. Because a free, decolonized Palestine would deal a great blow to US imperial power. It really would. There's a reason why they're putting all of their eggs into the Israeli settler colonial basket. They view it as a critical imperial outpost that allows them to be the empire that they are. To me, I can't understand for the life of me why countries in the global south right now are not taking more serious action on this. They all want a weakened US empire. I think the majority of the world wants a weaker American empire, including in Europe and Canada. But they're not doing it. If they really want to do it, decolonize Palestine. Force Israelis to transform and switch paths and stop being an imperial outpost settler colonists in Palestine, and force them to change their paths and become part of the region. Not as an Israeli settler colonial state, but as Israelis who will now share this land in a decolonial political system with Palestinians. If that happens, you've just moved all of those people onto your side against American imperialism as opposed to what they are now, which is one of the most critical agents of US imperialism around the world. So it is actually not just a moral imperative, but it's also in people's self-interest across the majority of the world to ensure Palestinian decolonial freedom. Though again, you hear some discussions of this allegedly happening behind the scenes, I'm not a believer of that unless I see it in action. So, but that's where we are today. But make no mistake, without economic pressure on Israel and Israelis, this will never stop. The Israelis have received one message from the world, and one message only, for the last 75 years. you will be rewarded for what you are doing you will be rewarded for what you are doing to the Palestinians. And they have been. So why would they stop? According to them, why would they stop? They keep getting rewarded for it. Not punished, but rewarded. Why would they stop? You've got to raise the price. So only BDS is the only reasonable thing that you can do, wherever you are in the world, is to put economic and political pressure on Israel so much that it will start to calculate, no, we can't keep doing what we're doing. That's what I mean about forcing Israelis to transform, because they're not going to transform on their own. The only transformation happening within Israel is that they become more racist, more corrupt. I'll end it there. Thank you.